The vision had come to her 3 nights in a row, always the same. A man in chains, moonlight falling through a narrow grate, and a voice inside her chest that whispered, "Save him, or the world unravels." Yvain Brimley did not know his name. She did not know his face. But when the 3rd night came and the dream would not release her, she rose from her bed, wrapped herself in a dark cloak, and walked barefoot through the frozen mud toward the fortress that swallowed the horizon like a sleeping beast of stone. The dungeons beneath it breathed cold and rot. Torches flickered against damp walls, throwing shadows that moved like living things, whispering warnings she refused to hear. Yvain pressed herself into the dark, her heart a war drum, until she found the cell the vision had shown her: iron bars, straw floor, and a man kneeling in chains, with his head bowed low, as though he had already made peace with dying. When she lifted the torch, he raised his eyes to hers. They were pale as winter ice, and for one suspended moment, neither of them breathed. Something passed between them, unspoken, ancient, impossible to name, a current that struck her chest like lightning and rooted her feet to the stone floor. He did not look like a man awaiting death. He looked like a man who had been waiting for her his entire life, as though every road he had ever walked led only to this cell, this night, this face. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and rough, yet strangely gentle, as if some part of him feared frightening her away. "Neither should you," she whispered back, already working the lock with trembling fingers, refusing to let him see how violently her heart was beating. The chains fell. He rose to his full height, towering over her in the dim torchlight, and for one heartbeat, his hand lifted toward her face as though he meant to touch her cheek, to know if she was real. Then he caught himself, some ancient restraint holding him back. "Who are you?" he breathed, searching her face like a man memorizing something he could not bear to lose. Yvain only shook her head, unable to explain a dream she barely understood herself. She grabbed his wrist instead, and the warmth of his skin against hers felt like coming home to a place she had never been. They ran together into the dark tunnels, her pulse roaring, his gaze burning into her back, and neither of them yet understood what they had just set into motion, or how deeply their fates had already begun to entwine. 15 winters before the dungeon, before the chains, before the eyes that would not let go of her. There had been 2 brothers who once shared a single wooden sword between them, laughing as they fought for it in the frost-covered courtyard of Castle Oakmere. Darren Oakmere had been the elder by only 2 years, but even as a boy he carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone born to be watched, born to be followed. His younger brother, Colby Stormhaven, had inherited the same broad shoulders, the same storm-gray eyes, the same fierce hunger to prove himself worthy of their father's gaze. But where Darren's strength settled into calm, Colby's simmered into something restless, something that ached. They trained together beneath the watchful eyes of old Sten Ashford, the castle's weapons master, a man who had seen enough princes to know which ones were born to rule and which ones only wished to be. "Your brother fights with his mind first," Sten told Colby once, not unkindly, "and you fight with your anger. Anger wins battles, boy, but it does not win kingdoms." Colby had said nothing. But something in his chest had gone cold that day, and it never fully warmed again. The years passed the way winters do in the north, long, brutal, and unrelenting. The brothers grew from boys into men, and the bond between them, once so effortless, began to fray at its edges like old rope left too long in salt water. It was not one moment that broke them. It was 1,000 small ones. The way their father's eyes lingered a heartbeat longer on Darren during council meetings. The way soldiers saluted the elder brother first, out of instinct rather than command. The way servants whispered the future king when Darren passed, and said nothing at all when Colby did. On the night their father, King Aldrich Oakmere, formally named Darren his heir before the full court, Colby stood at the edge of the great hall, applauding along with the others, his face arranged into practiced pride. Only his hands betrayed him, clenched so tightly at his sides that his nails left crescent wounds in his palms, small red half-moons that stung far less than the truth being spoken aloud for the entire kingdom to hear. Second son, second always. That night, a voice found him in the shadows of the corridor. A councilman named Jarek Dunhaven, smooth-tongued and patient, a man who had spent years watching Colby's resentment grow like a seed buried just beneath the surface, waiting only for rain. "It is a great injustice," Jarek murmured, "how the crown falls only to blood order, and never to merit. Your brother is a fine warrior, my prince, but you have fire. Kingdoms are not built by calm men. They are built by men willing to burn what stands in their way." Colby said nothing that night, but he did not tell Jarek to leave either. It took 9 more years for that seed to become a plan. 9 years of smiling beside his brother at feasts, of fighting shoulder to shoulder in border skirmishes, of accepting Darren's genuine affection with a private, rotting shame that curdled slowly into resolve. Darren, for his part, suspected nothing. He loved his brother with the uncomplicated loyalty of a man who had never learned to doubt those closest to him, a flaw that would nearly cost him everything. The trap, when it finally came, was elegant in its cruelty. Word arrived at the Castle of Unrest along the northern border. Raiders, it was said, striking merchant caravans near the frozen pass of Ravengard. Darren, ever the dutiful king, rode out with a modest company of 12 men to investigate personally, trusting the intelligence his own brother had delivered to him with grave concern, etched carefully across his face. There were no raiders. There was only an ambush, paid for in Colby's coin and orchestrated by mercenaries loyal to no crown but gold, men who struck in the dead of night, overwhelming Darren's guard with brutal efficiency, killing 4 of his 12 men outright and leaving the rest broken and scattered into the wilderness. Darren himself fought like a cornered wolf, wounding 3 attackers before a blow to the skull dropped him into darkness. When he woke, he was in chains, stripped of his royal insignia, his face bloodied beyond easy recognition, transported like common cargo toward a border fortress dungeon where no one would think to look for a king. Colby's orders had been explicit. Let him live, but let him rot, forgotten, until I decide otherwise. Even in his ambition, some fragile thread of brotherly mercy had stayed his hand from ordering an execution outright, though as the days passed and the crown settled with terrifying comfort onto his own head, that mercy grew thinner with each passing week. By the time the kingdom mourned its vanished king, presumed dead in a raider attack, Colby Stormhaven sat upon the throne of Oakmere, a false grief painted expertly across his face, while his brother knelt in darkness, waiting for an execution that had quietly, secretly, been ordered at last. Far from castles and thrones, in a small village pressed against the edge of a frozen fjord, a girl named Yvain Brimley grew up learning that the world rarely gave without first taking something in return. She was 6 when her parents were lost to a fever that swept through the village like a hungry tide, taking the strongest and the weakest alike, without discrimination. She was raised afterward by an aunt, Randy Coldharbour, a bitter woman who saw the girl not as family, but as an unwelcome burden thrust upon her by cruel fate. There was no warmth in that house, only chores before dawn, harsh words in place of comfort, and long nights where Yvain lay awake listening to the wind claw at the shutters, wondering if anyone in the world would ever choose to love her without obligation weighing down the choice. The village was not kind to strangeness, and Yvain, even as a child, had always been strange in quiet, private ways. She spoke to the sea as though it could answer her. She wept during storms, insisting she could feel the sky's own sorrow. She drew symbols in the frost on window panes that she swore she had seen somewhere before, though she could never say where. The other children called her touched, cursed, hollow-headed, cruelties that stacked themselves into walls around her heart, brick by careless brick, until by the time she reached 15, she had learned the safest thing to do with her strangeness was to hide it entirely. The only person who never made her feel broken was a weaver named Cassandra Eve, an older woman with clever hands and a sharper wit, who ran the small loom house at the edge of the village where Yvain began working at 14 to earn her keep away from her aunt's cold roof. Cassandra had no patience for the villagers' superstitions. They fear what they cannot weave into a pattern they understand, Cassandra told her once, guiding Yvain's fingers along a loom thick with indigo wool. But thread that seems tangled at first often becomes the most beautiful part of the cloth, child. Give it time. Give yourself time. It was in that loom house, among bolts of wool and the rhythmic clack of wooden shuttles, that Yvain found the only true safety she had known since her parents' death. Cassandra taught her patience, taught her the quiet dignity of skilled hands, and, though she never said it aloud, taught her that being different did not mean being unworthy of gentleness. Still, the loneliness never fully left her. At night, in the small room above the loom house where she slept, Yvain often pressed her palm against the cold window and wondered if somewhere in the wide, frozen world there existed a single soul who might look at her and see something worth staying for. She was 19 when the visions began. The first came on an ordinary night, indistinguishable from 100 others, until sleep pulled her under, and she found herself standing somewhere she had never been, a stone corridor lit by flickering torchlight, damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of iron and earth. She saw a cell. She saw chains. She saw, though only for a fractured heartbeat, before waking gasping into darkness, a pair of eyes pale as winter ice, staring back at her as though he had been waiting his entire life for her to arrive. She told no one at first, certain it was only a dream born of exhaustion and the isolation that had shaped her since childhood. But the vision returned 3 nights later, sharper this time, more detailed. She saw the exact turn of the corridor, the specific pattern of moss creeping along the stone, the low, groaning creak of a door, somewhere deeper in the dark. And beneath it all, a voice that was not quite a voice, more a certainty pressed directly into her bones. Save him, or the world unravels. You look tired, Cassandra observed one morning, watching Yvain's hands falter over the loom, thread slipping loose between trembling fingers. Bad dreams. Yvain hesitated, torn between the old habit of hiding her strangeness and the desperate need to speak it aloud to someone who would not call her cursed for it. I keep seeing a man, she finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. A prisoner, somewhere far from here. I don't know his name. I don't know why I see him, but it feels... She struggled for the word. It feels like remembering, not dreaming. As if I already know him, somehow, though we've never met. Cassandra studied her for a long moment, her clever eyes uncharacteristically serious. My grandmother used to say some souls are woven together long before their threads ever touch the same loom, she said slowly. Perhaps you are simply seeing a thread that has not yet reached you. Yvain wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss it the way she dismissed every other strange thing about herself. But that night, the vision came a third time, more vivid and undeniable than ever before. The corridor, the cell, the chains, and the eyes that held hers, with an intensity that made her wake, with her heart slamming against her ribs, and tears inexplicably wet on her cheeks. She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the voice in her chest refusing to quiet. Save him, or the world unravels. She did not know, as she finally rose and began preparing for the long, cold journey that instinct alone seemed to guide her toward, that 15 years of brotherly betrayal, royal ambition, and buried grief had led inevitably to this single night, to a dungeon beneath a distant fortress, to a king stripped of his crown and left to die forgotten in the dark, and to the improbable, impossible thread that had somehow bound her fate to his, long before either of them had drawn breath to speak the other's name. The vision that had haunted her for weeks was no longer a dream. It was a summons, and she could no longer refuse it. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will touch your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. A jagged wind howled through the pines as Yvain half carried, half dragged him deeper into the mountain trees, her lungs burning, her legs screaming with exhaustion. Behind them, distant shouts rose and fell like waves crashing against rock, soldiers combing the tunnels, the forest edge, searching for a prisoner who had vanished like smoke. It was Yvain who spotted the hunter's cabin first, half buried beneath drifts of snow and long abandoned by the look of its sagging roof and frost-cracked door. She pulled him toward it without hesitation, shouldering the door open against years of disuse, and together they collapsed inside just as the first flakes of a new storm began spiraling down from a bruised, heavy sky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply breathed, ragged, relieved, alive, collapsed against the cabin's rough wooden walls while wind screamed outside like something furious at being denied its prey. It was he who broke the silence first, still catching his breath, his pale eyes finding hers in the gray half-light filtering through a cracked window. "You saved my life tonight," he said quietly. The roughness in his voice softened now, stripped of its earlier wariness. "A life you had no reason to save. I don't yet understand why you came for me, but I will not forget it." "I'm not entirely certain I understand it myself," Yvain admitted, a breathless, almost embarrassed laugh escaping her. "I only know that if I hadn't come, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have happened to you." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or something gentler, something that looked almost like wonder. He studied her for a long moment, as though committing every detail of her face to memory. The wisps of golden hair escaping her hood, the flush of cold and exertion on her cheeks, the steady courage in eyes that should have been frightened and instead burned with quiet resolve. "I don't even know your name," he said softly. "Yvain," she answered. "Yvain Brimley." He repeated it once, quietly, as though testing the shape of it against his tongue, as though the syllables themselves deserved reverence. "Yvain," he said again, and something in the way he spoke, it made her pulse stumble. A beautiful name, fitting somehow for someone who appears out of darkness like a star. Heat rose in her cheeks despite the bitter cold pressing through the cabin's broken walls. "And you?" she asked. "What should I call the man I apparently risked my life for?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible, quickly smoothed away. "Darren," he said finally. "Just Darren, for now." She sensed the omission, the careful edges around whatever truth he was choosing not to share, but something in her did not press further. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was simply that his name, spoken aloud in that small, broken cabin, felt like enough of a gift for one night. "Darren," she repeated, and watched something in his shoulders ease, as though her acceptance of the partial truth had lifted some invisible weight from him. Outside, the storm worsened, wind clawing at the cabin's old timber frame, forcing them deeper into the single dry corner where a crumbling stone hearth still stood, blackened from long-dead fires. Yvain found dry kindling stacked beneath a rotted tarp, and within the hour, a small fire crackled weakly to life, casting flickering gold light across the cabin's narrow interior. They sat close together out of necessity. The cabin was small, and the cold demanded shared warmth, but neither of them moved away when the necessity became something more. Darren's shoulder pressed against hers, solid and warm despite the chains and cold that had marked him only hours before, and Yvain found herself acutely, almost painfully aware of every place their bodies touched. "Tell me something," he said quietly, watching the fire rather than her face, as though it were easier to ask difficult questions without meeting her eyes. "How did you know where to find me? A dungeon in a fortress you likely never set foot in before tonight, hidden behind guards and stone and iron?" Yvain hesitated, the old fear of being called cursed, touched, hollow-headed rising instinctively in her chest, but something about the darkness, the fire, the quiet intimacy of the moment loosened her tongue in ways it rarely was. "I had a vision," she admitted softly. 3 nights of the same dream. You, in chains, in that exact cell. A voice inside me insisting I had to save you, though I didn't understand why. I still don't. She glanced at him, half expecting mockery, half expecting the same fear the villagers always wore. "You must think me mad," but Darren did not laugh. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned to study her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, his pale eyes searching hers as though seeing something vast and unexpected. "I think," he said slowly, "that stranger things have shaped my life than a woman gifted with sight beyond ordinary men. I think the gods rarely announce their purposes plainly. And I think," he added, his voice dropping lower, softer, "that whatever brought you to that cell tonight, I am undeservedly grateful for it." The fire popped softly between them. Yvain felt herself leaning imperceptibly closer, drawn by a pull she could not name, could not resist, and for a moment, one suspended, breathless moment, she thought he might close the remaining distance between them entirely. His hand rose instead to brush a strand of hair from her face, fingers grazing her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted every hardened line of muscle beneath his torn tunic. "Yvain," he murmured, and the way her name sounded in his voice made her chest ache with something she had no name for. "Whatever comes next, whatever I must face when the sun rises, I want you to know that meeting you tonight has already changed something in me. I do not yet understand what, but I feel it." She should have asked what he meant. She should have pressed him on the shadow still clouding his eyes, the careful way he avoided speaking of his past, his enemies, his reasons for being chained in that cell to begin with. But instead, caught in the golden firelight and the impossible gravity of his gaze, she simply let herself lean into his palm, closing her eyes for one stolen heartbeat, allowing herself to feel, fully, foolishly, the warmth of a connection she had waited her entire, lonely life to find. They did not speak again for a long while after that. They simply sat together, shoulder to shoulder, watching the fire die slowly down to embers, each drawing quiet comfort from the other's presence, in a night that should have ended in death, instead of this fragile, unexpected tenderness. Dawn came reluctantly, gray light creeping through the cabin's cracked shutters, and with it came the distant, unmistakable sound of horns, hunting horns or war horns, echoing faintly across the mountain slopes. Darren's entire body went rigid the moment he heard them. Yvain felt the change in him instantly, the soldier replacing the man who had held her so gently only hours before, his jaw tightening, his pale eyes sharpening into something calculating and grim. "They're searching wider than I expected," he murmured, more to himself than to her, rising swiftly to peer through the cabin's broken window at the tree line beyond. "Which means whoever ordered my capture is desperate to ensure I'm not found. Desperate men make careless mistakes, but they also make dangerous ones." "What are you saying?" Yvain asked, though some cold certainty was already forming in her stomach. Darren turned back to her, and for a moment the mask of hardened calculation slipped, revealing something rawer beneath it, reluctance, regret, and beneath both, a fierce protectiveness that made her chest tighten. "I have to go," he said quietly. "Not away from you, towards something I must understand. Someone did this to me, Yvain. Someone arranged my capture with precision that speaks of betrayal from within my own walls, not enemies from without. I need to discover who and why before more lives are lost to whatever scheme is unfolding." "Then let me come with you," she said immediately, surprising herself with the fierceness in her own voice. But Darren shook his head, closing the distance between them to take her hands in his, warm despite the frigid morning air seeping through the cabin's broken walls. "If I'm right about the scale of this betrayal, then the road ahead is far more dangerous than the one behind us. I cannot protect you and uncover the truth at the same time. And I refuse," his voice roughened, "to be the reason harm comes to the woman who saved my life, without asking for anything in return." "You don't even know if I want protecting," Yvain said, though the fight in her voice was already softening into something more like fear. Fear of losing something she had only just found. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, brief and warm despite the tension gathering in his shoulders. "No," he agreed quietly. "I imagine you don't, which is precisely why I must insist, before your stubbornness convinces me otherwise." His thumb traced gentle circles against the back of her hand, an absent gesture that betrayed how difficult this parting truly was for him. "But I will return, Yvain Brimley. I swear it. Whatever waits for me in the world I'm returning to, nothing in it will keep me from finding my way back to this cabin, to this mountain, to you." Her throat tightened painfully. How do I know that's not simply a kindness spoken to soften a goodbye? For a long moment, Darren said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into the tattered remains of his tunic and withdrew something small, golden, and unmistakably precious. A ring, simple in design but clearly wrought with expert craftsmanship, its surface engraved with symbols she did not recognize, ancient and elegant. "Because I am leaving you the only thing of value I still possess," he said, pressing the ring gently into her palm and closing her fingers around it with both of his hands. "This ring has been in my family for generations. It carries more weight than gold alone. When I return, and I will return, you'll know without doubt who stands before you." Yvain stared down at the ring in her palm, its weight far heavier than its size suggested, something ancient and significant humming beneath the metal like a held breath. "Darren," she whispered, lifting her eyes back to his. "Who are you, really?" Something flickered across his face, guilt, perhaps, or simply the exhaustion of a man carrying burdens too vast to voice aloud. "Someone I hope you'll still wish to know," he said quietly, "once I've earned the right to tell you everything." He lifted her hand, the one now closed around the ring, and pressed a slow, lingering kiss against her knuckles, his pale eyes never once leaving hers. "Wait for me." Before she could find words to answer, he was moving toward the door, pulling his torn cloak tighter around his broad shoulders, transforming once more into the hardened, watchful figure she'd first glimpsed in that dungeon cell, fierce, commanding, every inch a man built for battles she couldn't yet imagine. At the threshold he paused, glancing back at her one final time, something raw and unguarded passing across his features. "Cassandra Eve," he said suddenly, "the weaver in your village. I heard you mention her name in your sleep last night, murmured like a prayer. If danger ever finds you before I return, go to her. Trust her judgment as you trust your own visions." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow and gray morning light, his footprints already vanishing beneath fresh drifts, as though the mountain itself conspired to erase any trace that he had ever been there at all. Yvain stood alone in the cabin's doorway for a long while after he disappeared, the golden ring clutched tightly in her palm, still warm from his touch, still humming faintly with a weight she could not fully explain. Somewhere beyond the mountains, war horns continued to echo, closer now, more urgent, and she understood, with sudden cold clarity, that whatever fate had connected her to this mysterious man was far from finished with either of them. She closed her fingers tighter around the ring, feeling the ancient engravings press into her skin like a promise carved in gold, and turned back toward the village, toward Cassandra's loom house, toward whatever answers awaited her there, unaware that the very kingdom rumored to be searching for its vanished king was closer to her small, forgotten life than she could possibly imagine. Yvain did not remember most of the walk back to the village. Her feet carried her instinctively along paths she had known her whole life, but her mind remained fixed on the weight in her palm. The golden ring, still faintly warm, its engraved surface pressing strange grooves into her skin, as though trying to speak a language she almost understood. By the time she reached the loom house, the morning sun had climbed halfway into a pale, indifferent sky, and her hands had gone numb from cold and exhaustion both. Cassandra was already awake, feeding kindling into the small stove that kept the workshop from freezing, and she looked up the moment Yvain's shadow darkened the doorway. Whatever greeting Cassandra had prepared died instantly on her lips. Her sharp eyes swept over Yvain's disheveled cloak, her windburned cheeks, the haunted, distant look in her gaze, and something in the older woman's expression shifted from casual welcome to immediate, focused concern. "Sit," Cassandra said simply, already reaching for a blanket to drape over Yvain's shoulders. "And tell me everything. Do not spare me the parts you think will make me worry. I will worry regardless." So Yvain told her, the visions, the dungeon, the man in chains with eyes like winter ice, the cabin, the fire, the horns echoing across the mountains at dawn. She told her about Darren, about the way he had looked at her as though she were something rare and impossible, about his refusal to let her follow him, about his promise to return. When she finally opened her palm to reveal the ring, Cassandra went very still. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable, before finally lifting it gently from Yvain's palm and turning it slowly beneath the pale morning light spilling through the workshop window. "Cassandra?" Yvain asked, unease creeping into her voice at the older woman's prolonged silence. "What is it?" "You know something." Cassandra's thumb traced the engraved symbols circling the ring's band, intricate knotwork interwoven with the unmistakable silhouette of an oak tree, ancient and precise. "I have not seen a ring like this in over 20 years, she said quietly. "Not since I was a young woman working in a merchant's household near the capital, before I came to this village." She looked up, and there was something almost fearful in her expression now, though carefully contained. "This is the royal sigil of House Oakmere, child. The oak and the knot. I have seen it stamped on royal decrees, embroidered into banners, carved above the gates of the capital itself." The workshop seemed to tilt slightly around Yvain, the floor no longer entirely steady beneath her. "That's not possible," she whispered, though even as she said it, fragments began rearranging themselves in her mind. The way Darren carried himself, upright and commanding even in chains, the quiet authority beneath his rough voice, the careful way he had avoided speaking his full name, his past, his purpose. He said his name was Darren, just Darren. Cassandra's eyes widened slightly, something between disbelief and dawning understanding crossing her features. "The king," she breathed. "The kingdom has mourned King Darren Oakmere as dead these past 2 weeks. Killed, they say, in a raider ambush near the northern pass. There have been processions, mourning bells. His brother, Colby Stormhaven, was crowned in his place not 4 days past, with all the appropriate grief a nation could ask for." She looked back down at the ring, then up at Yvain, her expression grave. "Child, if what you're telling me is true, then the man you pulled from that dungeon cell is no ordinary prisoner. He is the rightful King of Oakmere, and whoever placed him in those chains did so with the full intention that he never be found alive." Yvain's hands began to tremble, the pieces of the previous night rearranging themselves into a shape far more dangerous than she had imagined. "His brother," she said slowly, horror dawning in her voice. "He said someone arranged his capture, someone who knew the details, who orchestrated everything with precision. He suspected betrayal from within his own walls." She looked up at Cassandra, cold dread settling into her stomach. "You're saying his own brother did this to him?" I am saying, Cassandra said carefully, that a man does not simply become king 4 days after his brother's presumed death, unless the timing serves him rather conveniently. She closed Yvain's fingers back around the ring, her weathered hand steady, despite the gravity of what she was suggesting. You must be careful now, more careful than you have ever been. If the new king learns his brother survived, and that a village girl helped him escape, your life will be worth less than the thread on this loom. Yvain swallowed hard, clutching the ring so tightly its edges bit into her palm. He told me to come to you, she said. He said if danger found me before he returned, I should trust your judgment. Something flickered across Cassandra's face, surprise perhaps, or a complicated blend of pride and fear. Then he trusted wisely, she said quietly. Whatever comes next, child, you will not face it alone, but we must move carefully. And we must move quietly. A king in hiding is dangerous enough. A king in hiding whom his own brother believes dead. She shook her head slowly. That is the kind of secret that gets people killed. 3 days hard ride south, past the mountain passes and the frozen rivers, past villages that thinned into farmland, and farmland that thickened into the sprawling capital of Oakmere. Darren moved through streets he had known since childhood as a stranger, wrapped in another man's rags. He had traded his torn prisoner's tunic for a peasant's worn cloak stolen from a merchant's drying line outside a border town, and he kept his golden hair hidden beneath a rough hood, his once immaculate bearing deliberately hunched into the shuffling posture of a common laborer. It was humiliating in ways he had never imagined a king could be humiliated, reduced to skulking through his own capital like a thief, invisible to guards who would have once bowed at his passing. But invisibility, he had quickly realized, was its own strange gift. No one looked twice at a beggar. No one questioned a hooded farmer haggling over the price of bread in the market square. And so, Darren moved through Oakmere's streets unnoticed, gathering fragments of information from careless conversations, from tavern gossip, from the loose tongues of soldiers drinking away their coin after long shifts at the palace gates. What he learned confirmed every fear that had gnawed at him since the ambush. Colby had moved with unsettling speed. Within 4 days of Darren's presumed death, the council, conveniently absent several of Darren's most loyal advisors, who Darren now suspected had been quietly reassigned to distant postings in the weeks before the ambush, had confirmed Colby as rightful heir and crowned him with somber, well-rehearsed grief. The kingdom mourned publicly. Bells tolled, black banners hung from every tower, and beneath all of it, Darren now understood, lay a betrayal so calculated it turned his stomach. He needed allies, men who had served him personally, who owed their loyalty to his blood rather than his crown, who could be trusted not to report a ghost wandering the capital's streets straight back to the throne that now sat atop his brother's head. He found the first that evening in the modest home of a retired soldier named Egil Thornridge, a grizzled veteran who had once saved Darren's life during a border skirmish years past and had since retired to a quiet cottage near the capital's outer wall. Darren had debated the wisdom of revealing himself for the better part of an hour, crouched in the shadows outside Egil's door, before finally deciding that some risks were unavoidable if he meant to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Egil answered his knock with a suspicious scowl that transformed within seconds into slack-jawed shock. "By the gods," the old soldier breathed, staring at the hooded figure on his doorstep, as though seeing a spirit risen from the grave. "Your Majesty, they said, we were told—" "I know what you were told," Darren said quietly, stepping inside before any neighbor's curious eyes could catch sight of the exchange. "And I need you to understand, before anything else, that everything you were told was a lie, carefully constructed by my own brother." Egil's face darkened with a fury that made him look decades younger. "Colby," he said, the name coming out like a curse. "I never trusted the way he watched you, Your Majesty. Too quiet, too patient. Some men wear their ambition loudly. Others let it rot in silence until it's too late to smell the decay. He arranged an ambush, Darren confirmed grimly, lowering himself onto a wooden bench near Eagle's modest hearth, exhaustion finally cracking through the careful composure he'd maintained since the cabin. Paid mercenaries to strike my company under the guise of border raiders. I was captured, chained, and left in a border fortress dungeon to be quietly executed once he'd secured the throne. Then how? Egil began, bewilderment plain on his weathered face. A woman saved me, Darren said, and something in his voice softened despite the gravity of the conversation, an involuntary warmth he could not entirely suppress. A village girl with a gift I still do not fully understand. She freed me from that cell the night before my execution, guided by visions she could not explain, even to herself. Egil studied him for a long, searching moment, something knowing creeping into his expression despite the danger surrounding them both. You speak of her differently than you speak of the rest of this, he observed quietly. Careful, my king. A man with a stolen throne to reclaim cannot afford distractions, however remarkable. Darren's jaw tightened, though he did not deny it. She is not a distraction, he said simply. She may well be the reason I am still alive to reclaim anything at all. He shook his head, forcing his thoughts back toward the immediate danger at hand. But you are right that I cannot allow personal matters to compromise what must be done. I need to know who else remains loyal. Who among the council, the guard, the household, who can be trusted to help me expose Colby's treachery before he consolidates his power any further. Egil was quiet for a long moment, calculating. Odun Greymark, he said finally, captain of the Western Garrison. He was conveniently deployed to the coastal borders 3 weeks before your death, far too neatly timed to be coincidence. I've heard whispers he suspects foul play already. And there is Kirsty Riverstone, a scribe within the Royal Archive, sharp-eyed, discreet, and utterly loyal to your father's memory. She would notice if records had been altered to support Colby's version of events. Then that is where we begin, Darren said, new resolve hardening beneath his exhaustion. Quietly, carefully. I cannot move against Colby without proof the council and the people will believe. Not against a man clever enough to orchestrate my death and assume my throne within days. Outside, the capital's evening bells began to toll, marking the hour with the same solemn rhythm they had marked his father's death years ago, and his own death more recently still. Darren listened to them with a grim, quiet fury building steadily beneath his exhaustion, a fury that steadied rather than consumed him, sharpened by the memory of pale gold hair and fierce, steady eyes in a firelit cabin far to the north. Wait for me, he had told her, and he intended to keep that promise, but not before he had torn his stolen kingdom back from his brother's grasping, treacherous hands, piece by careful piece, until the truth could no longer be buried beneath mourning bells and false grief. The war for Oakmere, though neither side had yet openly declared it, had already begun. Meanwhile, far to the north, Yvain sat awake long into the night, the golden ring resting in her palm as she stared into the dying embers of Cassandra's stove, wondering how a single night in a dungeon cell had irrevocably tangled her fate with that of a king, and dreading, with a cold certainty she could not shake, that the horns she'd heard echoing across the mountains at dawn were only the first sound of a much larger storm gathering on the horizon. The attack came without warning, the way winter storms sometimes did. Clear sky one moment, chaos the next. Yvain was at the loom house, helping Cassandra sort dyed wool when the first scream tore through the village square. She froze, fingers still tangled in indigo thread, as more screams followed. Sharp, panicked, unmistakably real. Cassandra was moving before Yvain's mind fully caught up with what was happening, already crossing to the window, already going pale at whatever she saw through the frost-edged glass. Soldiers, Cassandra breathed. A dozen, maybe more. Royal colors. Yvain's heart slammed against her ribs. She joined Cassandra at the window and saw them. armored men on horseback pouring into the village's narrow central lane, steel catching the pale winter light, villagers scattering before them like frightened birds. At their head rode a man in dark leather, his face sharp and calculating, his eyes scanning the fleeing villagers with the patient, hungry focus of a hunter who had finally found fresh tracks after a long, frustrating search. Something about him struck Yvain like a physical blow. Not recognition exactly, but a cold, crawling certainty that she had seen this face before, in a vision she had dismissed as unimportant weeks ago, back before the dungeon, before Darren, before any of this had begun. A man with sharp eyes and a smooth, patient smile, standing over a chessboard of lives he considered his to move at will. "That's him," she whispered, the words falling out of her before she understood why. "I've seen him before. In a vision. He was the one giving orders, before I even knew about the dungeon." Cassandra's hand found Yvain's arm, gripping tight. "Then he is more dangerous than simple soldiers," she said grimly. "That is a man executing a plan, not merely following orders. We need to move. Now." But there was nowhere obvious to run. The loom house sat near the village's edge, but the soldiers were already fanning out with practiced efficiency, several riders breaking from the main group to search side lanes and outlying buildings. Yvain watched in horror as two soldiers dragged old Injal Fairwick from his home, shoving him to his knees in the snow, demanding answers to questions she couldn't hear from this distance, but could guess at with sickening clarity. "Where is the girl who helped a prisoner escape the border fortress? Who among you has seen a man matching this description?" "They're not here for the village," Yvain said, cold understanding spreading through her chest like ice water. "They're here for me." Cassandra didn't argue, because they both knew it was true. "The cellar," she said instead, already moving toward the back of the loom house, pulling Yvain along by the wrist. "There's a storage space beneath the floorboards. My late husband dug it for grain during lean winters. It's small, but it will hide you until..." "Until what?" Yvain cut in, panic sharpening her voice. "Until they burn the village looking for me? Until they hurt you, or Njal, or anyone else who might know something?" She shook her head, pulling back from Cassandra's grip, even as fear screamed at her to hide, to run, to do anything but what her instincts were now insisting she must do. "I can't let them tear this village apart, searching for someone who isn't hiding. Yvain, I have to give myself up," Yvain said, the words tasting like ash even as she spoke them. "Before someone gets killed for information they don't even have." Cassandra's face went sharp, with fear and fury in equal measure. "Absolutely not. Do you understand what that man will do to you once he has you? He will not simply ask polite questions, child. He will use you as bait, as leverage, as a blade to hold against the king's throat the moment he learns his brother lives." The word landed like a stone, dropped into still water. "The king." Yvain's hand closed instinctively around the ring she still wore on a cord beneath her tunic, hidden against her skin, still faintly warm despite the freezing air. If this man, Jarek, some distant memory of tavern gossip supplied the name, already suspected Darren was alive, then her capture wouldn't just endanger her. It would hand Colby the single most valuable weapon against his brother that existed in the entire kingdom. "Then I won't let them find me easily," Yvain said, new resolve hardening beneath her fear. "But I won't hide in a cellar while they threaten this entire village to flush me out either. There has to be another way." A shout rose from just outside, closer now, alarmingly close, followed by the heavy sound of boots crunching through snow toward the loom house itself. Cassandra's eyes widened, and whatever argument she might have made died in the urgency of the moment. "The back door," Cassandra said quickly, shoving Yvain toward it. "Through the trees, toward the frozen stream. There's a shepherd's shelter half a mile north, built into the hillside. It's small, but it's hidden, and few remember it exists anymore. Go. I will delay them as long as I can. Cassandra, if they suspect you helped me, Then I will tell them an old weaver knows nothing of prophecy and princes, Cassandra said fiercely, already pushing Yvain toward the door with surprising strength for a woman her age. Go, child, now, while there is still time. Yvain hesitated only a heartbeat longer before the sound of fists pounding against the loom house's front door decided the matter for her. She fled through the back into biting cold and knee-deep snow, her breath tearing ragged from her lungs as she half ran, half stumbled toward the tree line, praying with every desperate step that Cassandra would be safe, that the village would be spared, that somewhere, somehow, Darren would know she needed him before Jarek's soldiers closed the distance between hunting and finding. She did not get far before her vision struck her again, sudden, violent, nearly dropping her to her knees in the snow. This time, it was not a dungeon she saw, but a road, a stretch of frozen highway cutting south toward the capital, and upon it, riding hard beneath a banner she didn't recognize, a small company of soldiers moving north with grim, purposeful speed, and at their head, unmistakable even through the haze of vision sight, rode Darren, no longer disguised as a peasant, no longer hiding beneath humble rags, but dressed for war, his golden hair loose beneath a simple helm, his expression carved from granite and fury. He knows. The vision seemed to whisper directly into her bones. He is already coming. The vision released her as abruptly as it had seized her, dropping her back into the present, into cold snow, into burning lungs, into the distant sound of Jarek's soldiers systematically searching the village she had grown up in. She forced herself upright, forced her legs to keep moving toward the shepherd's shelter Cassandra had described, clinging to the fragile, desperate hope that the vision meant what she prayed it meant, that Darren was already riding toward her, that somehow, impossibly, he already knew she needed him. 3 hours hard ride south, Darren had indeed already learned enough to set his blood cold with fury. The proof Kirsty Riverstone had uncovered in the Royal Archive was damning beyond argument. Sealed correspondence between Colby and a mercenary captain named Ravik Surablade, payment ledgers disguised as border fortification expenses, and, most damning of all, a personal letter in Jarek Dunhaven's own hand, outlining the ambush route with chilling precision, weeks before Darren's company had ever set out toward the northern pass. This is enough, Egil had said grimly, studying the documents spread across Kirsty's small archive table. Enough to bring before the full council, enough to strip Colby of any claim to legitimacy the moment it's read aloud. But Darren had barely heard him. His attention instead fixed on a final piece of correspondence Kirsty had found, tucked at the bottom of the hidden file. A report, dated only 2 days past, detailing increased visionary activity reported near a northern village, and Jarek's handwritten order dispatching a company of soldiers to investigate and, if necessary, secure the source. Darren had gone very still, reading those words, a cold dread pooling in his stomach that had nothing to do with politics or thrones. They know about her, he said quietly, though the words felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep and vulnerable inside him. Somehow, they've connected the vanished prisoner to visions in a northern village. They're going after Yvain. Egil's face had darkened with sudden understanding. Your Majesty, we have enough here to move against Colby immediately, but if you ride north now, you forfeit the element of surprise. Colby will know you're alive the moment. I am aware of what I forfeit, Darren had cut in, already moving, already calling for a horse, for a company of the few soldiers Auden Greymark had quietly gathered from loyal garrison ranks over the past days. But I will not sit in this capital calculating political advantage while a woman who saved my life is hunted down because of a debt she owes to nothing but her own conscience and a set of visions she never asked for. Darren, I will return to finish this, Darren said, already pulling on armor he hadn't worn in weeks, feeling the familiar weight of it settle over him like a second skin, like the man he had been forced to become since chains and dungeons and betrayal had stripped away every comfortable pretense of safety. But first, I ride north, immediately, Tonight. And so he had ridden, hard and fast through the freezing dark, a company of 20 loyal men at his back, the documents proving his brother's treachery secured safely with Kirsty until he returned to use them. Because some things he had realized somewhere in the exhausting, furious miles between the capital and the northern villages mattered more than even the throne itself. He thought of pale gold hair and steady, fierce eyes in firelight. He thought of a golden ring pressed into her palm, a promise he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. And as the first gray hint of the northern mountains appeared on the horizon, he urged his exhausted horse faster still, driven by a fear more visceral than anything he had felt even in that dungeon cell, waiting for an executioner's blade. "Wait for me," he had told her. "Whatever comes next, nothing will keep me from finding my way back to you." He only prayed as the miles disappeared beneath his horse's pounding hooves that he would not arrive too late to keep that promise. The shepherd's shelter was little more than a hollow carved into the hillside, reinforced with old timber and a low turf roof that blended almost seamlessly into the snow-covered slope around it. Yvain crouched inside its cramped darkness, knees pulled to her chest, breath clouding in front of her face, straining to hear any sound of pursuit through the thick silence of the winter forest. She did not know how long she had been hiding when she finally heard it. Not the crunch of searching boots she had dreaded, but hoofbeats, distant at first, then rapidly closing, moving with an urgency that made her chest tighten with equal parts hope and terror. She pressed herself deeper into the shelter's shadows, uncertain whether to pray the sound belonged to rescue or to fear it announced her discovery. Then, cutting through the cold air, a voice she recognized instantly, roughened with exhaustion and barely restrained panic. "Yvain!" She was moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct, scrambling out of the shelter into ankle-deep snow, just as Darren swung down from his horse, armor gleaming dully in the fading afternoon light, his expression a raw mixture of relief and fury, the moment his eyes found her. "You're alive," he breathed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands framing her face as though needing physical proof that she was truly real, truly unharmed. "I saw the report. Soldiers dispatched to investigate visions in a northern village. I feared." "Cassandra," Yvain gasped out, fear for her friend crashing back over her despite the overwhelming relief of his presence. "She stayed behind to give me time to run. Jarek's soldiers are still in the village. I don't know if she's safe. I don't know what they've done to her." Darren's jaw tightened with cold fury, but his voice remained steady, commanding despite the emotion, roughening its edges. "Then we ride for the village now, together, and we end this. I have proof of Colby's treachery, Yvain, proof enough to bring before the entire council. But I will not let more innocent lives suffer for my brother's ambition while that proof sits uselessly in a capital archive." Behind him, his company of 20 soldiers waited, grim and ready, and Yvain felt something shift inside her chest. Terror, yes, but also a fierce, unshakable resolve that matched the look in Darren's pale eyes. "Then let's go," she said, already reaching for the spare horse one of his soldiers had brought forward. Before Jarek realizes his prey is no longer within easy reach. Darren caught her hand before she could mount, his thumb brushing briefly against the cord around her neck, where the ring still hung hidden beneath her tunic. A silent acknowledgement, a wordless promise renewed in the space of a single heartbeat. Then he was moving too, swinging back onto his horse with practiced ease, and together, king and visionary, they turned north toward the village, toward Cassandra, toward a confrontation that could no longer be delayed or avoided. Behind them, the sun had begun sinking toward the mountain peaks, painting the snow in shades of blood orange and violet, beautiful and ominous in equal measure, as though the sky itself understood that whatever awaited them in the village would mark the beginning of the end, one way or another, for the treacherous game Colby Stormhaven had set into motion so many months ago. Neither of them yet knew whether they would arrive in time to save Cassandra, or whether Jarek's soldiers, growing desperate in their failure to locate their true target, had already decided that an old weaver's life was worth less than the information they'd come to extract. They found the village in chaos, smoke rising from a single burning cart overturned in the square. Villagers huddled in doorways, watching Jarek's remaining soldiers with the wary stillness of prey, deciding whether fleeing was safer than staying still. Darren's company thundered into the lane with a force that scattered confusion into open panic among Jarek's men, who had clearly not anticipated facing armed resistance in what should have been a simple search and secure operation. "Where is she?" Yvain shouted, already sliding from her horse before it had fully stopped, ignoring Darren's sharp warning behind her. "Cassandra, where is the weaver?" A soldier moved to block her path, but Darren's blade was already at the man's throat before he could raise his own weapon, his voice carrying across the square with the unmistakable authority of a man born to command armies. "Stand down, all of you. Your master's schemes end today." Confusion rippled through Jarek's remaining soldiers, men who had been told they hunted a runaway village girl, not confronted with a king they'd been assured was safely dead. Several lowered their weapons immediately, uncertain loyalty crumbling in the face of genuine royal authority, standing armored and furious before them. It was Jarek himself who emerged from the loom house doorway, dragging Cassandra by the arm, a blade pressed warningly close to her throat, though even from a distance, Yvain could see the older woman's chin lifted in defiant fury rather than fear. "Your Majesty," Jarek said, his smooth voice strained now, calculation flickering behind eyes that had clearly not prepared for this particular reversal of fortune. "This is an unexpected development." "Release her," Darren said, dismounting slowly, his voice deadly calm despite the fury Yvain could see coiled beneath his composed exterior. "Your quarrel is with me, Jarek. It always has been, hasn't it? Ever since you first poured poison into my brother's ear, as a boy too young to recognize manipulation for what it was." Something flickered across Jarek's face, surprise, perhaps, that Darren understood the full architecture of the betrayal. "Your brother required no poison from me, Your Majesty," Jarek said, though his blade wavered slightly against Cassandra's throat. Only someone willing to acknowledge truths everyone else was too cowardly to speak aloud. "Enough," Darren said, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, his soldiers fanning out silently to surround the remaining resistance. "You have one chance to release this woman unharmed." "I will not offer it twice." Cassandra, seizing the distraction, drove her elbow sharply backward into Jarek's ribs, a move born more of desperate determination than combat training, loosening his grip just enough for her to twist free, stumbling toward Yvain's outstretched arms. Darren's soldiers closed the remaining distance instantly, disarming Jarek before he could recover, forcing him to his knees in the trampled snow. "Cassandra." Yvain gripped the older woman tightly, checking for injuries with trembling hands, relief crashing over her so forcefully her knees nearly buckled. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," Cassandra said, though her voice shook slightly despite the dry humor in her words. "I always did say that man had eyes like a snake, deciding which mouse to eat first." They did not linger in the village longer than necessary to secure it, leaving a portion of Darren's company to ensure Jarek's remaining soldiers caused no further harm, while the rest rode hard for the capital. Jarek bound and silent between two guards, his earlier confidence replaced now with the ashen calculation of a man realizing his schemes had finally, irreversibly collapsed. The capital received them in stunned, disbelieving silence, word spreading through the streets like wildfire the moment the gates opened to reveal their supposedly dead king riding at the head of an armed company. By the time they reached the palace, crowds had gathered along the roadside, murmurs of shock rippling into something closer to awe as Darren Oakmere rode through streets he had once feared he would never see again. The council chamber, when they finally reached it, fell into absolute silence the moment Darren entered. Still travel-worn, still bearing the marks of chains and captivity, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. Colby sat upon the throne at the chamber's head, and for one suspended heartbeat, the brothers simply stared at each other across the width of the room, years of buried resentment and betrayal hanging thick in the air between them. Then Colby rose slowly from the throne, his face draining of color, his hands trembling visibly at his sides. "Darren," he breathed, the name barely audible. They told me—" "Alive," Darren finished quietly, moving forward as Kirsty Riverstone stepped in with the damning documents clutched carefully in her arms, spreading them across the council table for every advisor present to witness. "No thanks to the mercenaries you hired, brother. No thanks to the ambush you orchestrated with Jarek's careful assistance." Gasps rippled through the assembled council as Kirsty methodically presented each piece of evidence. The sealed correspondence, the payment ledgers, Jarek's own handwriting, outlining the ambush route weeks in advance. Colby's composure crumbled with each revealed document, his earlier shock transforming slowly into something rawer, more desperate. "You don't understand," Colby said, his voice breaking, tears beginning to slip unchecked down his face as decades of buried resentment finally tore free from wherever he had kept them locked away. "You never had to understand because you never had to watch it happen to you. Every year, every council meeting, every soldier's salute that went to you first. I felt myself disappearing, Darren. Not because you did anything wrong. That was the worst part. You never once looked down on me, never once made me feel lesser, and somehow that made it so much harder to bear. I was drowning in your shadow, and you didn't even know you were casting one." The council chamber remained utterly silent, advisors and guards alike, frozen witness to a grief too raw and too genuine to interrupt. "I told myself I only wanted what should have been mine, by merit rather than birth order," Colby continued, his voice thick with unshed shame. "But that was a lie I built to make the poison easier to swallow. I wanted to stop feeling invisible. I wanted, just once, for someone to look at me the way they always looked at you." He sank back onto the throne steps, his crown-adorned composure finally shattering entirely. "And now I have taken everything from you to fill an emptiness that was never yours to fix. I am sorrier than these words can carry, brother. I know sorrow changes nothing now." Darren stood motionless for a long moment, old fury warring visibly against something else, something that looked, to Yvain's watching eyes, uncomfortably close to grief of his own. He had nearly died in that dungeon. He had lost weeks of his life to chains and cold stone because of his brother's carefully nurtured envy. And yet, watching Colby weep before the full council, stripped of every pretense and ambition, Darren found the rage that had carried him across the kingdom slowly, unexpectedly, giving way to something more complicated than simple vengeance. "I should execute you," Darren said quietly, and the words carried absolute authority, despite their softness. "By every law of this kingdom, treason against the crown demands nothing less." He paused, studying his brother's broken form with an expression that mixed sorrow and resolve in equal measure. "But you are still my brother, Colby. Whatever poison Jarek fed you, whatever envy festered unaddressed for too many years, I cannot bring myself to end the life of the boy I once shared a wooden sword with in the training yard, however deeply he has wronged me since." Colby looked up, something between disbelief and desperate hope flickering across his tear-streaked face. "You will not die today," Darren continued, his voice hardening now with the weight of judgment rather than fury. "But you will not walk free either. You will be stripped of all title, all claim to succession, and imprisoned within the northern dungeon, the same one where you left me to rot, until the council determines an appropriate span for your sentence. Perhaps time enough in chains will teach you what your envy never could, that the weight of a crown is never worth the cost of a brother's blood." Guards moved forward to escort Colby away, And as he passed his brother, he paused, meeting Darren's eyes one final time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for mercy I did not earn." Then he was gone, led toward the very darkness he had once condemned Darren to endure, leaving behind a chamber heavy with exhausted, complicated relief. Jarek's fate, decided swiftly by the council once Colby's confession and the documented evidence left no room for leniency, would be considerably less merciful, stripped of all position and sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom's borders, forbidden ever to return under penalty of death. It was well past sundown by the time Darren finally found Yvain again, standing alone on a quiet palace balcony overlooking the capital's torchlit streets, the golden ring finally freed from its hidden cord and resting openly in her palm as she watched the city that had so nearly cost her everything settle slowly into uneasy peace. "You found your answers," she said softly as he approached, not turning immediately, though she felt his presence settle beside her like warmth against the cold night air. "About your brother, about everything." "I found more than answers," Darren said quietly, turning to face her fully, his pale eyes catching torchlight in a way that made her breath catch despite the exhaustion of the day behind them. "I found that mercy costs more than vengeance, and that forgiving someone does not mean forgetting what they've done. I found that a throne means little without someone worth sharing it with." He reached out, gently taking her hand, the one still cradling the ring. "And I found, Yvain Brimley, that everything I felt in that dungeon cell, everything I felt in the cabin, on that mountain, in every mile I rode desperate to reach you again, none of it has faded. If anything, it has only grown fiercer." Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he could hear it. "Darren, I am not finished," he said softly, though a faint, unguarded smile tugged at his mouth despite the gravity in his eyes. "You saved my life, not knowing who I was, asking nothing in return. You risked everything, your safety, your village, your own heart, for a stranger in chains. I have ruled kingdoms and commanded armies, Yvain, but I have never known devotion as pure as what you offered me the night you found me in that cell." He lifted her hand, the one holding the ring, and closed his fingers gently over hers. "This ring has waited generations in my family for someone worthy of the weight it carries. I gave it to you not fully understanding, that morning in the cabin, that I was already giving you something far more permanent than a token of gratitude." His thumb brushed softly against her knuckles, his voice dropping lower, rougher with emotion he no longer bothered concealing. "Marry me, Yvain. Rule beside me, not as a queen chosen for politics or convenience, but as the woman whose courage and heart I have come to love beyond every crown, every throne, every burden this kingdom will ever ask of me." For a moment, Yvain could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the impossible distance between the lonely, dismissed girl she had been and the woman standing now on a palace balcony, a king's whole heart offered openly into her trembling hands. "Yes," she finally whispered, tears slipping unbidden down her cheeks, even as joy broke fully across her face. "Yes, Darren Oakmere, 1,000 times, yes." He did not wait a heartbeat longer. His hands framed her face the way they had in that dungeon cell so many nights ago, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful restraint holding him back. He kissed her fiercely, fully, a fire igniting between them that had been building since the very first moment their eyes had met through iron bars and flickering torchlight, every unspoken longing, every restrained touch, every mile-ridden desperate and afraid, finally released into a single, searing embrace that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, foreheads resting together beneath the star-scattered northern sky, Yvain slipped the golden ring onto her finger with hands that trembled with joy rather than fear. "A vision brought me to you," she murmured against his lips, "but it was love that kept me." "Then let destiny take whatever credit it wishes," Darren whispered back, pulling her closer beneath the torchlight and stars. I intend to spend the rest of my life simply grateful it led me to you. Below them, the Kingdom of Oakmere settled into its first peaceful night in weeks, unaware that the greatest chapter of its history was only just beginning, written not merely in the reclaiming of a stolen throne, but in the unlikely, unbreakable bond between a fallen king and the visionary weaver's apprentice who had dared, against every fear and every doubt, to save a stranger's life simply because her heart told her she must. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.